Welcome back, Lorcana players, it's Poisonous. In today's video, we're gonna dive into everything set champs. So this weekend is the kickoff to set champ season, and there's a lot of hype this time because the Maleficent playmat and Maleficent promo card look absolutely amazing, and there's gonna be a strong desire, of course, to win your set championship and claim that playmat for yourself. I know I'm gonna be gunning hard for it, so I'm gonna break down all the meta decks that you'll probably see at your set champs, and we'll go over some strategy for picking your deck and then break down some deck lists. As always, thanks for checking out the channel. I always appreciate your support. Drop a comment, like the video, exert the subscribe button, and let's go on a quest together. Now let's dive right in. Going into this last weekend, I think everybody knew that there were 4 main meta decks, but after this last weekend, I think we can probably say that there's 5 main meta decks, which of course increases the amount of choices you have, but also increases the amount of thinking you have to do about the matchups that you could face. The 5 meta decks are, I think Blurple is obviously the #1 choice. Amber Steel, very popular. Purple Steel was winning a lot very early on in the Fabled meta, and now is still winning a little bit, but has kind of slowed down a bit. And then over the last couple weeks, we've seen the emergence of Green Blue, the Clarabelle control deck, and that has popped up and started seeing a lot of representation at tournaments. And over the weekend, we had a big showing for the Dogs deck. That's the Chromacon Turnadog deck. No Turnadog anymore, so I've heard it called Chromadogs or lots of different names. But it's an aggressive but also kind of mid-rangey deck that shows a lot of promise, and you might see that pop up at your set champs as well. We'll start by taking a look at the overall meta representation. So this is based on the Inkdex meta matrix. This is basically how well these decks have been represented over the last 2 weeks at tournaments that are reported on the Inkdex website. In terms of meta representation, the most played deck at big tournaments is Blue Purple. And if you followed any of the streams of the CCQs or any of the other like 5K, 10Ks, consistently Blurple is probably even higher than 31%, but this is a kind of a showing of overall the decks that have been submitted, and it's probably even larger than this, but 31% on Blurple. Now in the last 2 weeks, about 20% of the field is Green Blue. They're hunting for those Blurple players. Amber Steel at about 16%. Purple Steel right around the same point at 14%. And the new Dogs deck around 6%. So not a lot of representation, which makes it kind of a sleeper in the current meta. So like I said, this is only data from the last 2 weeks. I thought that would be more relevant than the entire Fabled period. So it's not including some other tournaments that have happened more than 2 weeks ago. It only includes data that's reported. So, you know, in a huge field with like 500 players, only the top 32 or 64 decks might get reported. So the larger field might have more representation of some of these decks, but this is what we're seeing place, and this is pretty representative, I think, of the overall field that you could expect. So let's break down each deck and pairing individually. We'll start with Blurple because that's the most popular deck and the deck that you either want to play as, or you want to make sure that you're keeping in mind what you're ready to play again. So I pulled this data from inkdex.com. This is using the win rate matrix for the last 2 weeks to show you what matchups are good for Blurple and which ones are harder. So according to the win rate matrix, Blurple beats Purple Steel 59% of the time. So if you were anticipating that a lot of your local meta is going to be on decks like Purple Steel, then Blurple would be an excellent choice. In the Green-Blue matchup, it says that Blurple has about a 53% win rate. This deck, I think, is a tough matchup for Blurple, but I think that the meta is shifting a little bit, and the choices that Blurple players are making, they're adapting to Green-Blue, and I think what was once favored the other way is now pretty much 50-50. Anything this close is basically a 50-50 split. Against Green-Yellow, however, this deck has about a 38% win rate. There's not a lot of data because Green-Yellow is relatively new, but it does seem like it has a great matchup into Blurple. It's able to go fast and get under, but it's also got some tools like the Under the Sea to try and fight back, so it doesn't just have to play as an aggro deck. And about a 48% win rate against Amber Steel. The Amber Steel matchup is obviously one of the toughest matchups for this deck. It is winnable, as shown by the fact that it's almost a 50-50 win rate, but if Amber Steel gets the pieces that they need and if they're on the play, then it's very hard to stop them for pretty much any deck, but especially Blurple. You really need your early game cards to come together in the right order, otherwise you lose within just like 4 or 5 turns, which is pretty tough. This gives you an idea of what you can expect into the field. A great matchup into Purple Steel, and a 50-50 matchup into Amber Steel and Blue Green, and an unfavored matchup into the Dogs. So if you think there's going to be a lot of Dogs players, then Blurple might be a tough choice. So now that we've looked at the win rate for the deck, let's break down a very good Blurple deck. So this is a deck that actually won a CCQ on the weekend. So this was a deck list posted by Alberto Salas, and this is the CCQ Cardiff winning deck. We can see that it's got a lot of the core cards from Blurple, but there are a couple interesting things. The 1-drops are a little bit different. So we have a Rafiki, a couple Royal Guards, and 4 Basil. We have 4 Tipo, and then 4 Dumbo, Genie, and Elephant, which is pretty common now. And then we have Belle, Elsa, and 1 copy of Ursula, which is an interesting choice because it functions basically as a 5th Elsa. It allows you to exert a character so you can challenge it, but you can also play a song for free based on the cost of the character you exert, which means that you might be able to crack off a free into the unknown and then use the exert effect to also get challenges in on other characters. So it's a nice little touch. 2 TikToks to help with the evasive mirror, 4 copies of Hades. All the blue decks usually run 4 copies of Hades, so no surprise. 1 big Elsa. I've seen some decks that run 2, some that run 1. We have 2 copies of Monstro. I think that Monstro's main purpose is to deal with the blue-green deck. Also, it seems like it might be good against the Dogs deck. They have a lot of low strength characters. So if you can build a good hand size and then get a Monstro down, you can clear their board if their characters are exerted. Running 4 copies of Hypnotic Strength. This makes our early game characters able to swing and trade up, but it also takes out illusions. 4 copies of Sail, so just the rest of our ramp package. 3 Vision, 2 Finders Keepers, 4 Into the Unknown. The Into the Unknown is one of the best pieces of removal in the game currently, and 2 copies of Second Star to the right. This deck relies on Second Star as, you know, a card draw mechanism that doesn't cost you any tempo. Finders Keepers, obviously you have to spend, you know, a good part of your turn and your ink to draw the cards. With Second Star, if you have a couple of characters that can sing it at a convenient time, you can draw 5 cards and then you're set up with lots of resources for the rest of the game. However, that card is not as good until like the blue-green matchup where you don't want to have a lot of cards in hand necessarily, and it's uninkable, so it can sometimes get stuck in the hand. Notable things for this deck, it doesn't have the Iago, so it's not running any of the illusion characters. The thing with illusions is that the more meta illusions become, the worse they are, because people will play cards that just destroy them, and that means that you basically can't play them, because if Amber Steel is playing Fire the Cannons and Strength, or, you know, Green is playing Improvise, the Hypnotic Strengths. So there's lots of different cards that deal with those illusions and makes them kind of a bad play. The Iago, really great into a Blurple Mirror, but really bad if the decks are all running ways to get rid of your illusions very cheaply. So this deck was a huge first place winner for the first CCQ in the EU. So congrats to Alberto. Really great deck. So this is something that you could consider playing at your set champs, or you might expect if you know there's a Blurple player in your pool, you could see this exact deck. So you want to just kind of keep in mind what they could be playing and do your best to, you know, build for that or play around it. So the second deck in our rankings was the green-blue deck. This is the Baja Blast, Clarabelle Control, lots of different names for this deck. So let's break down the matchups for this deck. Got about a 47% win rate against blue-purple, so it's just the opposite of what we saw on the previous slide. 38% win rate into purple-steel, so purple-steel definitely the worst matchup for this deck in my opinion. I've played this deck in a couple tournaments and I did get second with it in a tournament, and the winning deck was purple steel. proves to be kind of a tough matchup. We have 45% win rate against the Dogs deck and 55% win rate against Amber Steel. So pretty close to 50-50 with the Blurple, the Amber Steel, and the Dogs. Slightly favored with the Amber Steel. I think that with more data, it could also be slightly favored with the green yellow. I think that any deck that runs a lot of copies of Under the Sea can do pretty good into that deck, assuming that their Ursulas don't rip all your Under the Seas. The bad matchup into Purple Steel is a little bit tough, so if you're thinking that you're going to see a lot of Purple Steel, this might not be the best deck to play. However, I think that it's still winnable, just a tough matchup. You think that the players that you're going to have the most difficulty with are on the worst color pairing for you, and sometimes it's easier to plan around that, but this deck still has fair matchups into all the meta decks. I think this is one of the better matchups into Amber Steel, so if you expect that there's a lot of Amber Steel in your local, the shift with Baymax into early Under the Sea is extremely good in that matchup. And I did play in a tournament with Green Blue where I went up against Amber Steel in the final, and I was able to win that tournament with a very similar deck to the one I'm going to show you. And I think that it's definitely a viable tournament deck. It was more favored into Blurple, but Blurple is kind of adapting. They're not building as big a hand size all the time, and they're being a little bit less greedy, which I think is helping bring the win rate back closer to 50-50. So let's break down a deck list from this weekend. So this deck is the Nexus Lone Star Day 2 winner. So the Nexus Lone Star was a 10K tournament. I think there was like a 5K tournament on Saturday and a 5K on Sunday. And this deck was the Sunday winner. We've got 4 copies of Bobby, 4 copies of Little Clarabelle. This is pretty standard, I think, in pretty much all the blue-green decks now. 4 copies of Tipo and Sail for ramp, running 4 copies of the 3-drop Clarabelle. The card draw is huge, and providing that second shift target on curve can stop the shift target from being taken out, because you have 2 options, and allow you to get that really important shift off. 3 copies of Donald Duck Perfect Gentleman. This card is huge for the extra card draw. It's really important when you have bigger, better characters than your opponent that you get access to them. So sharing card draw with them isn't necessarily a downside. And with 5 health, his butt is pretty big and hard to remove. We're also running 3 copies of Scrooge McDuck. The Scrooge is good because he provides a 5/5 body that quests for 2, so he can be pretty tough for your opponent to deal with. 3 copies of the Shift Baymax, very useful for doing the early Under the Sea. You can check out my green-blue deck guide for some kind of lines for the opening that are good against aggro. 4 copies of John Silver. The John Silver is really great into Amber Steel. Problem is that he sucks against Dumbo, and that's probably why like Purple Steel has a more favored matchup, because the Dumbo allows all the evasive characters to just ignore John Silver, basically. We have 4 copies of Basil. This character is really important in winning because he lets you bounce characters back to the hand for good tempo and for Clarabelle card draws, and he's just a really annoying and threatening character to get on the board. 4 copies of Big Clarabelle. They're only running 3 copies of Hades, I think just to like mitigate on inkables, and the Basil has a similar effect but not quite the same. 2 copies of Develop. In my opinion, I would probably run 2 copies of Improvise just to deal with illusions, but this person won a big tournament, I didn't, so take that for what it's worth. 4 copies of Vision to let you dig for the answers when you're looking for the Heads Held High or the Under the Sea, or you're welcome. And then we have our Wombo combo with 3 Heads Held High and 3 Under the Sea. It allows you to do a one-sided board wipe. All you need is enough ink to play one and sing the other, or sing both or play both. You end up with a lot of ink a lot of times with this deck, and you can wipe the opponent's board and get caught back up, and it's extremely strong. This is a great overall deck, and it's something that I'm strongly considering running for set champs this weekend. Next up is Amber Steel. This deck was the boogeyman at the very start of the Fabled meta. Everyone thought that with the lack of removal and a lot of the changes to the rotation, that this deck was going to be the tier 0 deck that nothing could beat, but it's proven to be a really strong deck, but definitely not an unbeatable deck. Into the field, we got a 52% win rate against Blurple, which I think think is good, Blurple being the most represented deck. And if you are really teched for that matchup and you know that matchup really well, I think you could probably, you know, inch a few more percentage points out of that. And then you're favored into the best and most populous deck that I think that you have a good chance in any tournament overall, especially if you can make your way to top cut and get a couple Blurple pairings, and suddenly you're right at the doorstep for a big win. Purple Steel is a tougher matchup. They're favored. We only have a 44% win rate against Purple Steel. They have a mid-range package that deals really well with what our deck is trying to do, and they can kind of go over top of it, but they are hard to get under. 45% win rate against Green Blue. This one is a tough matchup because they have some really interesting early game options with the Shift Baymax allowing them to do like a turn 3 under the sea and removing all your stuff. They also have other big characters that are hard to remove, and they have access to John Silver, and the John Silver is really good against the Amber Steel deck, preventing your key pieces from questing and forcing them to challenge and maybe like sack themselves into the big butts that the Green Blue deck is running. And the last matchup is against the Dogs deck. I think that the Emerald Amber deck is kind of a dark horse here. 31 seems really bad, but I don't know if there's enough data to like, you know, fully support if it's really that bad. I haven't played the matchup, so I don't know how it feels, but I think that the Amber Steel game plan is just to go fast and win. If you can prevent them from playing the big tramp by removing a couple of their early game characters, you have like a Fire the Cannons or a Strength, and then they can't get the turn 4 tramp down where they filter and now they can sing Under the Sea, then it seems like it should be a very winnable matchup. So I wouldn't put too much stock in the 31%. We'll need a little bit more data, in my opinion, to say that that matchup is really that heavily favored the other way. So let's take a look at an Amber Steel deck that did well this weekend. So this is the Stockholm CCQ second place deck. This was played by Mikhail Matilla, and it's very much in line with what we've seen from the Amber Steel decks lately. We got 4 copies of Aurora, 4 copies of Daisy and Rhino. We're also running 4 copies of Mulan. She's nice because she lets you filter for the pieces that you need, and she's a princess, so she can be played for free off of the turn 1 Aurora, allowing you to play a 2-drop still, or to have, you know, multiple 1-drops on turn 2. We're running 4 copies of Penny, 2 copies of Troubadour. I think that some decks do prefer to run 3 or 4 copies of Troubadour, especially if you're anticipating a lot of Amber Steel mirrors, because the Troubadour is one of the really important cards in kind of breaking the mirror. 4 copies of Doc. You know, Doc's the best card draw card in the game probably. 4 copies of Nala. She's a great card to play on like turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, and really close out the game. 4 copies of Lady. Lady into Nala, Lady into Doc when your hand is empty feels really great. 4 copies of Tiana. So Tiana was basically a nothing card until this set, and now she's like a $50 card, which is crazy, but she is so good when played on turn 2 by being discounted by Aurora that she's an absolute meta staple right now. 2 copies of John Silver. He forces your opponent into not being able to challenge with one of their characters, which might be, you know, huge if you can prevent them from being able to take out your Tiana or something, you know, critical. 4 copies of Pete. This is something that's come back to the deck. In the beginning of the set, actions weren't very prevalent, so nobody was running Pete, and now actions are very important because of decks like Green Blue and Purple Steel and Amber Steel. We got 4 copies of the Shift Rhino, 4 copies of Pluto, the bodyguard that just really protects your board and makes the combat math very difficult sometimes. Then we have 4 copies of Fire the Cannons and Strength of Raging Fire. So both of these removal cards are huge in breaking the mirror, but they're also important in breaking up the early games of like Green Blue, Green Yellow, and they can also stop your opponent on Blurple from getting their elephant out if you can pop their 1 or 2 drop and that's the only character they have. Then you can sometimes break up their game plan really easily. You go turn 1 Aurora, turn 2 you play a 1-drop and Fire the Cannons, or you play a free Mulan and a Rhino and a Fire the Cannons. So you can get a lot of value out of your hand early, especially if you can then go into like Lady Doc and just like refill, and suddenly you're in charge of the game. So really impressive to see the variety of decks that have been placing at the top of these CCQs and these big tournaments. So it's going to be a fun meta for sure with the set champs coming up. Our next deck is Amethyst Steel. This deck was a huge threat and force to be reckoned with early in the meta and has kind of shifted into a lower place, but I would say is still a serious threat and a deck that I would definitely not count out of your local set champs. Looking at the matchups, the matchup into Blurple is not great, sitting at around 41%. I think that this matchup is probably the reason why we've seen less and less Purple Steel, because Blurple being the most represented deck and the most popular deck and like the best deck in the format means that playing a deck that has a bad matchup into it is probably like the hardest choice. You really need to dodge that matchup, or you need to be able to like skill diff your opponent a little bit, or maybe build your deck to be a bit more aggressive to try and get under it, but then that softens your matchup into other decks. We have green blue. We have about a 62% win rate here. The Dumbo and the card draw, being able to have a small hand size but always having access to more cards really gets under the green blue deck. They're relying on you building a big hand size and then equalizing with Clarabelle. If you always have just like a small amount of cards and then you play Dock and then you play both the cards you draw and you never end up with like a significant amount of cards in hand, then it's pretty easy to play around the blue-green deck. And I think that that's why it's such a strongly favored matchup. Still, 62% is not like earth-shattering or anything, but having a favored matchup into a big deck is, you know, really good. 45% win rate against green-yellow. I think that the green-yellow deck, like I said, is not heavily represented in the meta, so it's hard to know how bad the matchup actually is. I would say it's probably about a 50-50 type matchup, where if they get all their pieces, then they're going to be tough to deal with, but you also have access to good ways to interact with them using Elsa and Strength of a Raging Fire. So their board, where they don't always want to exert their characters till they set up what they want to do, is something that you can fight back against with that interaction that purple has that some other colors just don't have. Amber Steel, having a 56% win rate here, is also pretty nice. So being favored into two of the big decks means that the Purple Steel deck is still viable. Just sucks that you have to kind of have the tough matchup against Blurple. But I think Purple Steel is still good. And we saw over the weekend that the CCQ in Stockholm was won by Amethyst Steel. They actually beat Amber Steel in the finals to win the CCQ. So this deck has 4 copies of Diablo. The Diablo is kind of passive, but he does replace himself, which is nice. So he's kind of like an aggro card. 3 copies of the Palace Guard, who's a great body to, you know, buff up and try and get some multiple trades. Captain Hook has been proven to be a really great 1-drop in this meta because he can trade up and combat is so important. We have our Surfer Mim, or the Skater Mim as people tend to call her. So she's just great at boosting your characters that you play on turn 1, or once you have a wide board, dropping her down and all your characters suddenly do more damage than they did before. 3 copies of Calhoun. Calhoun having resist and gaining you lore and just being like a great 2-cost is really good. 4 copies of Dock as the best card draw. 3 copies of Jafar. Jafar is a 3/2 body, which is good for a 2-drop. Gains evasive on our turn, so he can take out Dumbo. He can quest, or he can exert on Dumbo's effect to draw a card, and just gives you a bit of versatility with the deck. 4 copies of Giant Cobra. The burn is really great, allows you to gain 2 lore, which can be enough to close out the game. There's always a threat when your opponent's doing math against your deck of the instant lore gain, and when you have 2 docks in hand, or you have, you know, uninkable problems, then you can drop an uninkable using the Cobra, which is nice. 3 copies of White Rose. This is the GOAT at home, if you want to put it that way. Not as good as GOAT, but it's what we have now. 4 copies of Genie. The Dragon Genie is got a huge body, and he's got the same benefits as Jafar, where he gains evasive on your turn, which means that he can take out a card like Dumbo. He makes it difficult for cards like the 4-cost Genie, and he can tap with Dumbo to draw a card if you have nothing else going on. 2 copies of the Jafar that has Quest for 2 and gives Challenger 2. So he's kind of an aggro threat, and he allows your other characters to do trade ups and give your Calhoun 5 strength, and suddenly she can take out a card like the Donald Duck Perfect Gentleman. 4 copies of Dumbo, 4 copies of Genie. These cards are huge staples in the purple meta right now. Really great evasives, really powerful, really good cards. We're also running 4 copies of Yzma as another card draw option. So Yzma says that you can exert this character to fill your hand back up to 3 cards. So if you have 0 cards in hand, you draw 3, and that can be really good. She also quests for 2, so if you don't need the cards, then she's just like a nice 2 questing body. 4 copies of Elsa to get that interaction with your opponent's board. 3 copies of Hypnotic Strength. This helps pop the opposing illusions, but also just beefs up our characters to do good trades. And we're running 4 copies of Strength for Raging Fire here. Strength being one of the best, if not the best, removal card in the game. You curve out with a 1-drop, a 2-drop, a 3-drop, and then on 4 you sing the Strength for Raging Fire and remove the opposing best character, and you're in a really good position a lot of the time. So this deck was a winner of a CCQ, proves that Purple Steel's not gone. It's still definitely kicking around the meta, and a deck that you can expect to see on your set champs coming up. And last but not least is the Chroma Dogs deck, so our Emerald Amber deck. This was something that is relatively new, so there's not a crazy amount of data on ink decks compared to the other ones. So I would say take these win rates with a grain of salt. But looking at the meta matchups, we have blue-purple, we have 62% win rate. I'd say that this deck is probably the most accurate number of these because of the amount of blurple that there is in the meta, and the fact that after seeing it play on stream, I feel like this is a matchup that is more favored towards the green-yellow deck, and it feels good to have, you know, a really strong matchup into the number 1 deck. Purple Steel, 55%. I would say that this is harder to know if this is accurate because there's fewer games between these decks, but I could see that Purple Steel having interaction here and having some removal might make it a little bit harder for the Chroma Dogs deck. Green Blue, 55% win rate. Not sure how strong that is. I think that the Green Blue deck having access to Early Under the Sea causes a lot of problems for this deck. The only thing that this yellow green has going for it is that it has access to Ursula, so you can pick the Under the Sea and prevent that from happening. But I would say that overall, I think that the green, yellow, green, blue deck is going to be a very equal or even feeling matchup. And then the Amber Steel matchup being heavily favored for yellow, green. Not sure how true that really is. Seems like that is an extremely heavily favored matchup, which I would say if it was true, this deck would be, you know, an absolute stunner pick into the meta because it beats up on blue, purple, and Amber Steel, which are like almost top 2 decks. And if it can also beat green and blue, then it really is beating like the top 3 decks pretty consistently. So I'm not sure if it is that strong, but that being said, it did win the day 1 5K for the Nexus Lone Star tournament. So let's look at the deck list. It has 4 copies of Daisy, 4 copies of Lady, 4 copies of Bobby, 2 Merfolk, and then 3 copies of the more aggro, smaller Lady. We're running lots of ladies because we like the aggro package, but also the shift line to the big lady is extremely good. We got 3 copies of Merryweather. So this character lets you give strength to another character, which helps with trading up, but also works with the 1-drop lady that quests for more based on the amount of strength that you have. We have 4 copies of Lilo. The Lilo is really good as an aggro card, especially when you pair it with the Chromacon, so you don't mind as much if your opponent takes it out. It lets you preserve your hand size and build up things in your hand. 4 copies of Go-Go. So Go-Go is an absolute clincher. She's such a nightmare in certain matchups like Elsa, Hades. Those cards with 5 and 6 willpower really hate Go-Go because the damage sits on them, and then you never know when the Go-Go is going to come and really punish you for having all that damage sitting there. 2 copies of Tramp. He's really good because he's an enabler for the small lady. He's a shift target for the big Tramp, and he also helps with combat because he gives you strength to other characters. So there's lots of different reasons to play him. He's really a glue card that fits together with a lot of the other synergies of the deck. We have 4 copies of Ursula Deceiver. Removing those opposing songs really good, especially those Under the Seas and Strength of Raging Fires. 4 copies of Clarabelle. We're not running the Shift Clarabelle in this deck, but the fact that this Clarabelle gains you a card when you don't have more cards than your opponent is really good. 3 copies of Louis. He's there to provide some slowdown against more aggressive decks, and you could consider slotting him out, I think, but I'm watching it on stream. There were times where this card was just absolutely a nightmare to opposing decks. You got 5 cost Lady, 4 copies of her. She lets you bring back 2 characters that cost 2 or less from your discard when you play her, but she's also a 4/4 that quests for 2, so she's great at shifting, refilling your hand, and then trading or taking out another character, or just a questing character that's probably going to be like a trade or a 2-for-1 for your opponent. We have the big tramp that lets you draw cards when your characters are banished, and we have the 7-cost tramp who's just really great at filtering your deck, finding the pieces that you need, and he's a 2/6 that quests for 2. You can get him out on like turn 3 sometimes. A really great card, and so you can get him out on turn 4, and just like a really great card. You got 2 copies of Improvise, lets you draw a card, increases your strength to help with combat math, helps with the Lady that quests for more based on strength, and it pops illusions, which is really good. It can take out a Yago no problem. 2 copies of Under the Sea. Sea may be wanting more copies of this, but the Emerald Chromacon, having 3 copies of that makes it a little bit less necessary. The Chromacon is an absolute nightmare. If you've ever had to play against it, you have to do so much thinking and sequencing that it's just really hard to play against, so it's a really great card overall. You go, an aggressive 1-drop, couple more aggressive cards, and then a Chromacon. It's very hard for your opponent to stop you from winning because they are so stifled on tempo with the use of the Chromacon, and not a lot of decks are running removal for it. The only card that really is in the meta that deals with it is the 1-drop Clarabelle in blue-green. They could pay the cost and pop the item. So this is a really fun deck, and something that I think you could see as a sleeper pick that's kind of just coming to the surface now. Be curious to see what kind of representation it has at the DLC coming up in Bologna, but Set Champ starts the same weekend as that DLC, so I would say that there's a safe bet that you're going to see these decks regardless of how good or bad they do at the DLC, but it might shift the meta a little bit for weekend 2 of Set Champs, but week 1 we're going to see a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here. So those are the meta decks that I think you're going to see for the Set Champs this weekend. I would say that despite all the numbers and all the different ways that you can think about the matchups in your local meta, the most important thing you can do to prep for Set Champs is to play a deck that you're familiar with and that you're comfortable with and that you have practice with. One thing to pick up a deck that is favored into your biggest opponent's deck, but it's a completely different thing if that matchup is with a deck that you have no experience piloting. It takes practice to learn a lot of these decks and to get familiar with all the little techs and lines that you want to play against to really get the most out of those matchups. So get some practice in, watch some videos, watch some gameplay. If there's VODs for any of the big tournaments in these decks, then check those out and get prepared for your upcoming Set Champ. The numbers are one thing, but the experience is a completely different thing, and it's definitely more valuable. But I wanted to highlight the different decks, the deck list that you could play, and the deck list that you could be prepared to play against. So thanks for watching the video. As always, I appreciate all your support. Leave a comment, let me know what deck you're going to be playing. If you play in a Set Champs this weekend, let me know how you do, and I hope that you're all lucky and all win your playmat. Cheers.